Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session on FAIR and data management. So I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. In terms of the structure of the action, so I'm happy to take, I was planning on having questions at the end, but I'm happy with taking breaks in between. The presentation itself is split into two parts. The first one focusing on the FAIR principles and useful tools and resources, and the second part is more focused on data management and how to implement those and how to prepare for publishing in a fair way. So I'm happy to do, perhaps we can look at questions in between the two parts, and then again after the second part. After the second part as well, I have prepared a demonstration, a quick demo of a data quality tool that we developed at the UK Data Service, and it shouldn't take more than 10-15 minutes, and then again we can look at questions after that. Okay, so if I think that was everything. Oh yes, I should also mention that my Wi-Fi has been a bit fussy in the last few days, so I would probably, I think the best idea would be to close my camera during the presentation, just to save some bandwidth, and then I'll turn it back on during the questions, and then at the end as well, of course. Hopefully that should be fine. Okay, so I think I mentioned everything now. I'm happy to start. Okay. Right. So just to quickly mention that all the information provided in this webinar are just highlights given the time limit. So we'll be touching on the most important aspects of FAIR and data management, but there will be more. I'm sure there's more detailed information available on the websites and the resources that I will mention in this presentation. Okay. Okay, so just to, Santiago already introduced me, but I'll say a couple more words. So I work in the data publishing team at the UK Data Service. We are based very close to London here, and we archive data from both the UK and international data as well. And I will start with a quick introduction of ourselves as well, as in the UK Data Service, but here is a breakdown of the session. As I mentioned, there are two parts. The first one will focus generally on FAIR, some examples of migration data and case studies where data that's already been published has been used. I wanted to include that here as an example. And of course, we'll look at resources and tools to publish data fairly. And then in part two, we'll look at how to prepare to share this data fairly. So we have a few aspects here of data management that we'll look at briefly. And then we have the demo here, and QA My Data is the software that I mentioned earlier. And also we'll look a little at where to publish data, and we also have a discussion at the end, and then quick exercise if we have time for it, and yeah, any questions again. So we can do questions after part one, then after part two, then we'll have the demo, and then we'll just have questions after that and a discussion. Okay. Right, so moving on to, starting with part one, yeah, this information was already in the slides above, so I won't go through it again. So we'll go straight through. Okay, so just to continue with the introduction. So who we are at the UK Data Service. We are funded by the Economic and Social Research Council, and we are a single data point of access for a wide range of secondary social science data. We provide support and training for data creators with accessing, managing, sharing, and using data. Okay, and in terms of background, so data sharing is becoming more and more important across multiple disciplines because it provides benefits not just to ourselves as researchers, but also to our institutions, our funders, and the general public more widely. It is essential here that we have good research data management habits, because if we don't deal with data management considerations early in our project, it can lead to potential problems later on. So the core message here is to think about data management throughout the whole life cycle of the research project, and to so that this enables us at the end of our projects to publish our data fairly. Nowadays, many funders and publishers, journals have specific requirements for data handling, and require the data and the script to be available at the end, to be made available for application purposes. And sometimes the data management plan is also necessary in the initial grant application to ensure that researchers have considered these aspects early on. Okay. And I also included a YouTube tutorial there for you to get more information about us and the data that we hold. Okay, so in terms of, I included here some examples of migration data, and these are all links that you can have a look at. They're provided by different archives and different providers, data repositories. I'm not going to go through them, but I just wanted to include this as an example of very good data that is published already out there in a fair way. Yeah, and we'll have a look at the case study in the next slide. So this is a project that was commissioned by London First, a non-for-profit consortium of businesses, including a number of important financial institutions, to analyze the impact of migration on the London labour market. The aim of the research was to provide policymakers and service planners with a factual summary of how migration to London from Europe and beyond has affected London's population, workforce, and economy. The analysis was carried out between 2016 and 2017, and it focused on trends in migration to London between 2005 and 2015. Okay, so the researchers in this project used several case studies. I'm sorry, I think I am talking about the next slide. That was my mistake. So I was talking about this project. I went a bit ahead. I have my notes here just because I tend to forget things very easily. So this is the project I'm talking about. I'm sorry for that. I'll go back to the previous slide in a second. So the researchers in this project used the several data sets here. So they used the ONS Annual Population Survey, years 2006 to 2016, the ONS Annual Business Survey, the London Business Survey, and the identified data from these data sets was linked and matched at aggregate level with comparable characteristics from the APS and the Labour Force Survey, and this helped to identify industry sector, employment percentage, and type, salary band, country of origin, nationality, time in the UK, region, London Borough, and skills of position and role. So when the data allowed such analysis, the researchers explored the relative contributions of EU and non-EU born workers. The reason why I included this example and the previous one as well was to showcase the value of publishing data fairly for future and further reuse. These projects would not have been possible without all these data sets that have been made available for reuse in a fair way. And I'll go back now to the previous slide. This is another project that looked at dispersal policy, onward migration, and integration of refugees in the UK. I included here the DOI, so you can go go and have a look. This is just a screenshot of how the record looks like in our catalog. This will be very important when we look at FAIR principles, so in terms of accessing data and all the metadata that needs to be provided. That's why I included the screenshot here. We have the DOI here. And yeah, if you'd like to read more about the project, I included links everywhere. Okay, so we already looked at this, and we'll move on to okay, so I wanted to, as part of this long introduction as well, and to further vouch for the importance of archiving data in a fair way, I wanted to share some lessons we gathered from a migration crisis seminar we organized in 2019 here at the UK Data Service. So we invited various stakeholders, including researchers, research participants, third sector representatives, as well as other archives, such as the Archive of Migrant Memories in Rome. And the seminar focused on complexities and opportunities of sharing, archiving, and reusing migration data. And if anyone in the room at that point had any doubt about the value of data sharing, I'm sure they left with a slightly different view, to say the least, because we had a very interesting talk from Edward Packard, a historian who he does his research on the Basque children of 1937 that came to the UK through the Kindertransport, fleeing the Spanish Civil War. He noted the fragmentation of data sources available for his research and said that his work was similar to a jigsaw puzzle, as not many historical records can be found and yeah, data to use in his project. So he called upon migration researchers to contribute to reference archives, and he really made the case for the importance of having data shared for future research. So I just wanted to include that here. Okay, so now moving on to the FAIR principles and how can we publish our data in a fair way. So in terms of what makes data good for sharing and reuse, so there are a couple of things that come to mind. So we want high quality data, we want accurate data, well organized, of course, so that if, of course, we've not been part of collecting that data, it needs to be well organized for someone with no prior knowledge to make sense of it and use it correctly. It should ideally be easily accessible and well documented, and have long-term validity in terms of file format. So it needs to be, it needs to be able to be used in 20, 30, 50 years from now. And all these principles are incorporated somehow into the FAIR principles. So we want findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. And now we will look individually at these principles and what we should look for to ensure that the data that we publish satisfies these principles. Okay, and here's a breakdown of the principles. I'm sure you've seen this online as well, so I'm not going to focus too much on it. But each principle has a list of tick boxes, if you wish, that you need to consider. So so we would need a DOI, so a globally unique and eternally persistent identifier, that the data is described with rich metadata, that the metadata is registered or indexed in a searchable resource. So this would be a data catalog. When you go to an archive and you search for a keyword, then that counts as metadata that has been indexed into that data collection, so that you can easily find it in that catalog. Okay, so to be accessible, it needs to be retrievable by this identifier, so by this DOI that it's assigned to it using a standardized communications protocol, that this is open, free, and universally implemented, so the access level is clearly stated on the data data collection page, as we saw in previous slides, and I included that screenshot there. And so when access needs to be regulated, so not everybody would have access to that data, there needs to be a clear protocol for authentication and to authorize access to that data. Okay, to be interoperable, this is in terms of file formats and having accessible, shared, and broadly applicable language for knowledge representation. And that metadata needs to use vocabularies that follow FAIR principles. So these are vocabularies such as the DDI schema that are widely used, and they are similar throughout the archives that use them, so that everything is consistent in terms of the metadata information that is provided. Okay, and then to be reusable, metadata needs to be, of course, very rich, have a plurality of accurate and relevant attributes, and the license needs to be very clear and accessible, and needs to meet domain-specific community standards as well. So, for example, we focus on social science. Other archives may focus on different fields. So that would need to be to be taken into account here for reusability. Okay. And of course, the SHA consortium covers the whole data cycle, and FAIR principles should be followed throughout. As I mentioned from the very beginning, that's why data management is so important, having that data management plan at the beginning of your project. So from concept and collection of data to processing, distribution, discovery, analysis, and then repurposing, so publishing it in an archive. Okay, that's why data management is so important. Again, I cannot say that enough. And yeah, to ensure that we publish very good quality data in a fair way. Okay. So now we're going to look at every principle in more detail and what we need to look for to make sure that that our data is fair, and that the archives that we choose to publish our data in our data repositories. I should mention I will use archives and data repositories intermittently. They mean the same thing, pretty much the same thing. So yeah, what do we need to look for? So in terms of being the data set being findable, which is the first principle. So it should have a unique and permanent address. I used address here, that would allow it to be found using a discovery portal. So that data catalog that I mentioned, that every archive would have, where researchers can go and search for a particular data set they're interested in, and this is referred to as a persistent identifier, and it's part of the dataset citation. So we have an example here of this data set, and the DOI is here at the end, and this is permanent, and this is different from a regular URL that you would use, in the sense that a URL cannot be, you know, it might not be valid in a few years, or it might not be maintained, whereas a persistent identifier, a permanent one, this DOI will exist forever. Okay, so it will not disappear at any point. Okay, another aspect that we need to keep in mind in terms of findability is that the dataset needs to have very rich metadata. So this machine readable metadata that describes the dataset and is used to index the datasets in an archives, in its data catalog. Okay, so it allows it to be easily found. Examples here of data catalogs, I added a few, but what is important is that when you go and deposit the data with an archive, you will probably be asked, you know, to fill in a form with information about the data set. So that would be, again, you know, keywords, geography, topics, etc. And all that information is will be transformed into machine readable metadata that can be used to find that data that you're publishing in the future. Okay, so the key here to look for and to ask an archive when you're getting in touch with them to archive your data is to check that the data they would be publishing would have a DOI or this persistent identifier, this handle that they would be minting this identifier. And I included a YouTube video here as well that we produced about this. I'm not going to play it now, but yeah, the presentation will be available, so you can have a look at that in your own time. Okay. Again, in terms of findability, I included an example here. This is from Harvard Dataverse, and this is migration and HIV risk in India. This is a good example because we have the DOI here included at the very top. This is the keywords and the description of the data set. And so, yeah, this is the key that we were looking for. Yeah, so this persistent identifier is included in the citation of the data set. Okay. Okay, moving on to accessibility. So what do we think about in terms of when we think whether is the data accessible, whether our data satisfies this FAIR principle? So, of course, accessible doesn't mean open. It can be, the data can be open, but not necessarily. And we will have a look at this in further down when we look at the data management section and how we, the difference between anonymized data and pseudonymized data. So some data, of course, will need to be placed under access restrictions due to privacy concerns, consent agreement, disclosure risk, or commercial interests. But the key here in terms of the data being fair is that the access should be implemented using a standardized protocol. So that should be very clear, made on that project, on that datasets page. When someone sees it for the first time, they need to be able to easily find the access level that applies to that data, and they should be able to easily find instructions on how to access it. And of course, archives need to implement this in their system so that everything is uniform and it's consistent across all the collections that they hold. Okay, and in terms of access, so I provided here an example that we use. So at the UK Data Archive, we operate a three-tier approach, and every archive or repository will have their own version of these access levels. More or less the same. They might be called differently, but they would be the same. The first is open access, of course, which is available to anyone from without the need to register or sign a license. This is data that is considered to be low risk or no risk, that has been anonymized, and yeah, it doesn't have a disclosure risk per se. The second category is safeguarded, and there are different versions of this option depending on the data in question. So normally safeguarded data can only be accessed by registered users who signed an end user license. So this end user license will be specific to every archive or repository will have a version of this themselves, but depending on the particularities of the data deposited, it might be that special conditions need to be met on top of this registration, such as obtaining permission from the depositor, for example, and embargoes can also be applied for limited periods of time to allow researchers to publish their findings. And finally, there is controlled access, and this is where there will be very sensitive data or data that cannot be anonymized or pseudonymized without making it unusable for future users. This is available normally for remote or safe room access, and so researchers will need to complete the training course, for example, and pass a test before they're being granted access. This is there's quite a lot of procedures that need to be met in terms of, you can only access the data from one computer. The outputs that your the tables and the analysis that you're doing using that data would need to be checked as well, so that it doesn't contain any disclosive information that you would publish, of course. So this is very, very sensitive data. Okay, but the idea is that these access levels should just be very, very clearly stated on that catalog record. So that screenshot that we saw earlier, it just needs to be very clear in terms of it being accessible from a fair point of view. Okay. Here's an example, again, a screenshot of a dataset from Zenodo, published on Zenodo, migration and tuberculosis in Berlin, and the access level is clearly stated here. Okay, so it's open access, and you can also see data collections categorized based on their access level. So most of them are open, and then we have restricted, closed, embargoed. So as you see, closed, restricted, every repository would have a version of these access levels that I mentioned earlier, but it's just important that that is very clear which one applies to the data set. Okay. And another example here, this is from our own catalog, a data set on the Mediterranean migration crisis. So here we have a button that says access data. So if we select this, it will take us to this standardized protocol that would give us information about how we can access that data. And we have an access level category here that will tell us that these data are safeguarded. So we would have to register first with the UK Data Service before we can access this data. Okay, and again, we have the breakdown of all the data sets that we have in our catalog based on their access level here. Right, moving on to interoperability. I always had a problem saying this word. Data sets are considered to be interoperable if they have machine readable metadata. So that information that we provide when we contact an archive and they and they ask us to fill in this form with information about the data that we're trying to publish. Okay. These would be, of course, in specific formats, language and vocabularies, or ontologies. So these would be these, internationally recognized vocabularies that are used by a variety of archives. So there's consistency there across. And of course, it's important to keep in mind for interoperability that this is very much software dependent. So here we think about data formats as well and file formats. So it's important that these that these would be accessible in a few years from now, in decades from now, and so that the software that we use, at least at the time that we are publishing, we think that this will be maintained in the future. Okay. And formats should also, it should be community agreed. So in your community, what that your peers are using, then it probably should be published in that format. It should be open as well, so as opposed to proprietary, so people can use it and access it easily. And it shouldn't be encrypted, and it should, again, be suitable for long-term preservation that I mentioned before. Okay. And the metadata should use, again, that DDI schema that I mentioned earlier. So these internationally agreed, community agreed standards and vocabularies. And I included here, I don't think it's, well, yes, there's a link here to the DDI schema that you can have a look at. And I gave here an example of this is the data catalog. Yeah, you can have a look as well. This also uses DDI. Okay. An example of interoperability. That metadata is captured is consistent across data collections and versions of the same study. So here we're looking at the same study throughout years, and we looked here at Understanding Society, which is UK household longitudinal study. It's one of the largest panel studies in the world. And I think this has been now going for 27 years. And of course, it's very important to capture this metadata. So these metadata fields that I mentioned on the right here, so it's very important to have these captured in every edition. So in every year, we capture the same information, so that is also comparable and consistent. Of course, this is very important. Okay, and every edition. So it's not just every year, it's every edition. Every year there might be different, there are different, I think we have about 200, how many are there? 483 studies for this data, for this project, for this big longitudinal study. Okay. Another example is and I looked here at the data catalog records, so the EMM survey registry. So metadata is captured in the same, the metadata captures the same across different data collections. And we have here the different metadata fields that the EMM survey register captures. So we have the scope, the name of the region, the starting date, end date. Yeah, and this is also so that researchers can easily search through and categorize, as we see here. So if we're interested in a specific region or a target population, so we can easily sort. Yeah, and that's also a benefit of having these standard metadata fields. Okay. Okay, moving on to reusable. So what it means into what we need to look for to ensure that our data is reusable. So it needs to have accurate and relevant attributes and provenance information, so that machine readable metadata. It can also be in text format. So, for example, abstracts would not be machine readable. They could be, but they can also be in text format. Does it meet the main relevant community standards to allow it to be reused again? And licensing. So licensing is very important in terms of reusability. So that data collection needs to have clear reuse rights. And you know, when someone arrives to that data set, they know what are the terms and conditions that apply to using that data. And ideally, to make it as reusable as possible, a license should make the data available to the widest audience possible, and allow the widest range of uses possible. Okay, so for example, for open access data, Creative Commons International and different variations of that would be an example here. And the more restrictive licenses are the end user licenses. So those licenses that apply to restricted access data, so to safeguarded data, and those are more restrictive, and each archive, of course, and repository would have their own version, as we mentioned before, as we spoke before. Okay, and again, I already covered this in the previous slide, but so is that the license agreement is that legal agreement between us as the depositor of the data and the data repository. So it informs the user what they're allowed to do with the data, and depending on the access level. So as I mentioned before, for open data, it would be Creative Commons with variations, and for safeguarded or restricted access data, it would be some variation of an end user license that archive is producing. Okay. And I provide an example here of our end user license. So the data, the license that we have at the UK Data Service for safeguarded data, and here are the terms and conditions that apply. So not to use data for commercial purposes without obtaining permission. Right, I don't know which one to read, but there are a few. Okay, to use the correct methods of citation, of course, and acknowledgement in publications, etc. To destroy the data at the end of the project. So all this is covered here. Yeah, every repository and archive will have a version of this for the restricted access data. Okay, so just to conclude, what are the key elements in terms of FAIR? So probably the most important, they're all important, of course, but it's very important that a data collection has this persistent identifier, such as DOI, so that it is findable. Once we publish it and we've put all this effort into making it fair and reusable, we want that data to be available in the long run. So this permanent identifier is very important, and this metadata, this rich metadata as well, is very important to describe our data. The more, the better. Of course, the more information someone has about our data, the more likely they are that they understand it better and they use it accordingly and correctly. Okay, and a clear license as well. And I provided here a publication as well on fairness of services. It's a report, and I'll let you read through that if you're interested. Is very comprehensive, looking at fair principles and how they apply in practice. Okay. And now we're moving to useful resources. So we have the SSH Open Marketplace. So this is a discovery portal. I'm sure you know about it already. That harmonizes all the tools and services and software, datasets, etc. And this is useful information throughout the research data lifecycle. And I won't focus too much on this because I think everyone is already familiar with this. How you can use that in terms of making your data fair, so you can find relevant software and services, link to tutorials and other training material, also a forum where other peers have recommended tools or software, and I included a timeline here as well. I won't focus too much on this because I believe everyone is already familiar with this. Another useful resource is the SESDA Data Management Expert Guide. So in terms of data management that we're going to look at in the second part, this is very important. It has expert tips and in-depth tips for specific types of data, training events as well. And the SESDA data catalog includes about 15,000 data collections harvested from different archives and repositories throughout Europe. So it's a very, very comprehensive resource in terms of data management. Okay, we also have quite a lot of resources here. So planning to sharing, legal and ethical, documentation, formatting. So our website, UK Data Service, you can also have a look there. Okay. Also, in terms of having a data management plan that we mentioned at the beginning, the DMP Online is very useful. They have examples. They can you can create a DMP, and then they would provide advice on that and how to improve it if you've missed any sections, for example. And they have quite a lot of examples as well that you can have a look at. Okay. Another very useful resource is the Gopher Starter Kit. This is a starter kit for research data management, and it's an open ecosystem for different stakeholders that can work together in order to make data fair and yeah, provide resources for researchers to do that. Okay, I'll let you, of course, look at this. I won't focus too much on it because you will have access to the slides. Okay, and there's further data management guidance from ourselves here. I included. There's also a very good book that we've published a second version last year, and various training materials. Okay, I won't focus too much on that because I included the links. So this is the end of part 1. It was about 43 minutes. Now we move to part 2, and as I promised, we'll see if there are any questions at this point. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I see there's nothing there so far. Sorry, Santiago, did you want to say something?
No, I was just sorry. I was just to encourage people to make questions on your presentation. Okay. I think some of them are writing.
I see there are no questions so far. So should I? Sorry.
There are a couple of people who are writing.
Yeah.
So let them finish. Let them finish.
Okay, so I see there's a question so far whether the unique identifier, should the unique identifier and its link redirect the users to all the versions of the same database or only the last one? That's a very good question. So the DOI, there will be a different DOI for, or at least a different version of the DOI. So for different versions, it will have, that extra, _1, _2, and at least that is how we, that's how the DOI that we produce is, and in general, that is how it should be for all data that is published using this. So all versions should be accessible. Of course, when you click on the DOI, it will take you to probably the last version. However, there should be clear information there on how you can access the previous versions. And all the previous versions would have a slightly different version. So the root, if you want, of the DOI will be the same because it's the same data set, if you want, but an extension would be different across versions. Okay, any tips to not incur in licensing compatibility when uploading data to more than one repository? So in terms of uploading data in more than one repository, we normally advise against that because, so if we think about it, there should only be, if every data repository will publish one DOI, then we will have multiple data sources, and ideally we advise against duplication of data sources. Ideally, a data set and a particular version of that data set should only be available from one source. Once a DOI is minted for that particular data set, it should only be available from that one source. So I think that then there shouldn't be licensing compatibilities if we only publish in one place. Yeah. Can reusable data be updated? Someone else asked. Sorry, I'm saying someone else because I know this is the public chat, but we normally don't we don't use names when we do our webinars. That's why. But Patricia asked, can reusable data be updated? Yes, so that would be the versions that were mentioned, that we discussed earlier. But it's very important that, again, that DOI that it takes that into account. Yeah, so that it has that extension and that it provides access to the different versions, so that all the, if someone uses your data now and then in 2 years from now you provide a new version, then they're going to cite the last version, right? So the initial version, and that version should still be available for replication purposes. Okay. To decide which repository to choose. Okay, so the question from Paul, how to decide which repository to use? Isn't there a risk of some of them going out of business? I would normally go for, of course, this is always a possibility, right? We don't know what's going to happen in the future. However, if you normally go for a national archive, that will probably always be there, hopefully. So I would check that with that particular repository. For example, in the UK, every university has developed now their own repository. So just to allow researchers to publish in that repository, and of course that is supported by that university. So in a way that the kind of guarantees that it's going to be around in the long term. However, I would say the repository that's putting all the effort into ensuring that they have the proper procedures, and they abide by FAIR, and we would think that they would be around for quite a long time. However, I would check with them, and again, if you want to be absolutely sure, I would go for a national archive, or just an archive that has been along for quite a long time, that has some roots, to say so, so that they're least likely to disappear. Okay. And in worst case scenario, if the data wouldn't be available anymore, that DOI should still exist. So of course the data is stored with the particular physical archive, but the metadata that you publish, that would still be available forever using that DOI. But again, that is the worst case scenario. So yeah. Okay, so I don't think there are any more questions at this point. I will go ahead with part 2 then, if that's okay. Right, so how to prepare for... Sorry?
No, I said that's okay. Good. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. How to prepare for sharing data. So now we're going to look in more detail at data management and how to prepare in advance to ensure that we publish fair data, right? And we're going to look at security, storage, encryption, documentation, anonymization and pseudonymization, file formats, and then we have the quick, the demo of QMI data, and then a quick discussion. Okay, right. So documenting data. So this is very important when you submit your data in an archive. So it is very important to ensure that data is understood and reused correctly, and to make sure that it is reusable in the future. The most important things about documentation is simply that it should allow other users with no prior knowledge of the data to understand it and reuse it correctly in their projects. And so what information would they need to make sense of it? And archives in general, they use this documentation also as supporting documentation, so this would be available to future users, but also it helps archives and repositories to process the data correctly, to perform data disclosure reviews, for example, before they publish the data. Okay. So what exactly should be included as documentation when archiving data? So examples here include methodology file explaining how the data was collected, sample size, fieldwork protocols, codebook, user guide, blank versions of the consent form and information sheet. That is, if consent was used as a processing ground for personal data under GDPR, the questionnaire that was used, and any links to reports or publications based on that data as well, using their DOIs, of course, where possible. Okay, looking at data level documentation, so all structured tabular data should have adequate variable names as well as variable labels and value labels. In terms of variable names, here are a few suggestions. So the most important is to ensure that they match question numbers in the questionnaire used. Also, it's important to use meaningful abbreviations for interoperability across platforms. Variable names should not exceed 8 characters. Okay. Sorry, perhaps I'm moving a bit too fast. Looking at variable labels for, so some of the same apply. So make sure that they, sorry, that they reference the question text and that it includes units of measurement where applicable, value labels as well, ensure that these are described, as well as that missing values, for example, are declared and differences between these are recorded separately, so missing as opposed to skipped questions, etc. Okay, so next I wanted to include an information about what a user guide should contain and give you an example. So a user guide can include any project specific information that would be needed to understand the data, such as interview schedule, methodology, study findings, transcription notes, code book, anonymization logs, etc. If you would like to see an example, I included here this collection available from our catalog. It has a very good user guide, so I'll let you look at that if you wish. Okay. In terms of anonymization and pseudonymization, so this is of course it's quite a discussion here but I'll try to be as brief as possible. So in terms of transparency and reproducibility, this has been, as I'm sure you know, there's a big drive out there for open science and having data as open as possible, but as closed as necessary, right? So of course we all want to have data as open as possible, but that's not necessarily that's not possible all the time, especially for pseudonymized data. And here comes this difference between anonymized or pseudonymized. So from our point of view, of course, we want to publish data that is that provides as much content as possible and that is as reusable as possible in the future. If we try to anonymize this data too much, well, not too much, if we just try to anonymize it, then we might remove too much information that is very valuable to that data for someone who might reuse it in the future, right? So of course, pseudonymized data from that point of view will need access regulation, but will also provide future users with more, for example, demographic information, and those kind of information that we refer to as indirect identifiers. So it wouldn't be personal information, but it would be information that perhaps pieced together, if someone was to really try to, they perhaps could identify someone, so there's a residual risk of disclosure there. So that would be information such as gender, ethnicity, profession, etc. So that doesn't necessarily point to an individual, but when you piece them all together, that does have that residual disclosure risk. So that's why we conduct disclosure reviews, okay, to ensure that we publish data under the correct access level. Okay, so that was what I wanted to say between the difference between the two. They all have, of course, their value, and it would depend a lot on the type of data that you're collecting. Yeah, what we need to keep in mind is that we just want to have data that has as much potential for reuse and valuable content as possible. Okay. So in terms of how to do it, so anonymization or pseudonymization, so what exactly you should be looking for if you were to do this yourself. The first thing would be to remove direct identifiers, of course. So these are personal data. So these are items that would allow someone to identify a particular individual. So names, addresses, exact job title, etc. in the process. of anonymization or pseudonymization, we can simply remove them, or if it's possible, we can reduce the precision of detail through aggregation. So we would provide, for example, occupational categories as opposed to exact job titles, an area instead of a village, etc. Okay, a similar method can be used for low count categories, and restricting upper and lower ranges of a variable by recoding them into categories or banding them, as we call it, would help hide outliers. So example here are very young or very old participants relative to the rest of the sample, similar with income and other variables, okay? Right. In terms of file formats, which we already discussed, is very important. Making sure that we consider what are the most important software to use for the research we are undertaking. And as we mentioned before, this is very, very important in the long term. And is worth pointing out. So for long-term preservation, the best formats are standard, interchangeable, and open software. And for more information on what exactly this means for data you're collection, so we have guidance here for the data that we archive. And again, every archive you choose or repository you choose will have guidance around this. So I would advise checking with them as well. We also have here the Digital Preservation Coalition guidance on preservation formats. So I would also check that as well. Okay. We will now look briefly at data security and storage issues. So it's very important when collecting data to think in advance about mechanisms and procedures that need to be put in place to prevent unauthorized access, use, change, disclosure, or destruction of our data. So especially when we talk about personal data, this is very, very important. So what are possible solutions and how we go about adopting data security strategies? So some of this information is perhaps very basic, but it's essential to avoid the issue we spoke about in the previous slide. So controlling access to computers by using secure passwords and locking our computers when away, ensuring that our antivirus protection is up to date, that we protect our computers from power surges that might render them useless. Restricting access, particularly to sensitive and personal information, is essential. Always making sure to keep those separate from anonymized data or pseudonymized data. Ensure that we use encryption across all devices and at all locations. This is a safer, more secure option than simply using passwords. Because, for instance, if someone were to steal or have access to your laptop, they can access your files, even if your laptop is password protected, simply by removing the hard drive and installing it into another device. Finally, ensure that you properly dispose of unwanted copies of data and equipment at the end of the project. And it's vital to remember here that personal data needs more protection than anonymized or pseudonymized data. So while some solutions might be appropriate for some types of data, they might not be appropriate for personal information. Okay. Because we touched on encryption, I provided here some options just to mention that we don't recommend one in particular. You might opt for one over the other depending on your operating system and what exactly you need encrypted. So whether you wish to encrypt an entire hard drive or just a particular folder or file. At the bottom of the slide, you can find the link here to a YouTube playlist that we put together, and that contains several tutorials on different encryption software. So I'll let you have a look at that as well if you're interested. Another aspect to consider is having a digital backup strategy to avoid data loss or data destruction. And there are multiple things to consider here. So what we need to back up, where, what type of media we can use, how often we need to duplicate or synchronize the information backed up, how long do we need to keep it. And here there might be different data retention policies that apply as advised, for example, by ethics committees or your funder. Also, it's very important that you check these backups regularly to ensure that they're still in working condition. And you might wonder, why is this so important? Well, there have been multiple cases recorded, some over social media, perhaps some of you have seen them, where the only copy of the data has been destroyed during a house fire, or stolen or forgotten in a train. And having the data backed up in a secure location prevents us from losing time-consuming work, or results perhaps, or having to collect new data. So that's I think it's very important to keep in mind, and consider non-digital storage as well. Okay, thinking about file sharing and collaborative environments, especially if you have colleagues in multiple countries, for example. So looking at file sharing, so we often share our files with our research partners, and doing this over email is not considered best practice. There are other options, as I'm sure you're aware. So there are virtual research environments available, or locally managed, such as OwnCloud or Zentu. Or physical media can be sent encrypted through the post. There are cloud solutions such as Google Drive or Dropbox. However, we have to be very cautious about security concerns here, especially if we're handling personal data. There are some options that claim to be more secure. What we recommend is just to assess the risk of using cloud storage, whether these are appropriate for your data. And a very good idea would be, again, to ask your institution or university for guidance on this. We ourselves, we don't advise storing personal data or commercially sensitive data in the cloud. Yeah, but you can, of course, you should check with your institution. Okay, and looking at data disposal, so this is very important to consider at the end of the research project, especially if you've used personal information. So if we simply delete that data, that's typically not sufficient. So deletion only unflags the files. If we write over the data by reformatting, that is also not sufficient. If it's incredibly sensitive data, the only way to destroy that data is to physically destroy the hard drive. And there are specialist services that can do this. And I provided some examples here of software that can also do that, but I will, again, please check with your institution for guidance on how to dispose of data, especially personal data. Okay, so now we're running into the demo. That would be the end of part 2, and I'm happy to take any questions now. However, I'm aware of the time, and if you'd like to have the demo as well now, it should take about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a look at questions afterwards. Hope that's okay. Okay, and is that okay, Ricardo? Santiago, sorry.
No, yeah, whatever you.
I'm happy to take questions now. Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah. So I'll. If you have any questions.
Do you want to do questions, trainees, or would you rather go for the demo and then?
Oh, I see someone is typing.
Yeah.
Okay, go for the demo.
Yeah.
No, go for the demo.
I think that then you can go for the demo, and then if you have questions on this second part, then you might prepare them while Anca is doing the demonstration.
Yeah. Okay. So just a bit about Ehtmigdata. So we wanted to look at data creation processes and how these are sometimes viewed, as some dark art that archives do behind the scenes. And so we wanted to create an easy to use tool that can correct and clean numeric data that are not widely are not widely cleaned by the researchers themselves. They're normally done in archives. So we developed this free and easy to use open source tool. We called it Ehtmigsurveydata, and it provides a health check for numeric data. So the idea is that you upload a data set into the software, and it will an HTML file outlining all the issues that it found, and I included a list of those in the next few slides as well. So the tool offers a number of tests, configurable tests, that we categorize into file, metadata, data integrity, and identifiers. So that would be direct or indirect identifiers. It can be run on popular file formats, so including SPSS, data, SAS, and CSV. It creates that health check report, the HTML report that I mentioned. Okay, and can be easily, it would be downloaded into your computer or laptop, and it can be easily used and integrated into data cleaning and processing pipelines. So it can also be adopted by archives and repositories. We make it available from our GitHub page under a Creative Commons, so it's openly available. And I will show you where you can find it on our website during the demo as well. So in terms of the checks that it does, so I provided a list here. I won't go through all the list because I see we're time limited, but so we would look at the maximum length of variable labels, for example, spelling mistakes, odd characters in variable names and values, missing variable labels, and this is in terms of metadata checks. And then you can customize it as well. So you specify the character and the length of the variable. Then we have data integrity checks. So we will check for duplicate IDs, odd characters in string data, spelling mistakes, percentage of values missing. And then you can select the thresholds here. So the script is highly customizable depending on what you want the software to look for. And then we have disclosure control checks. So we would check for direct identifiers. So this would be personal information using a regex pattern search. And yeah, so I think this is how the report would look like, just a screenshot, but we will see how it looks like in practice now that we will produce it during the demo. And we'll have a last slide with a final checklist. Okay, but we'll do the demo now. I will also share my screen, and I hope. Okay, I hope that you can see my screen now. It's very okay. Right. Santiago, could you please confirm that you can see my screen? Is that just before I
can see, yeah, that's fine.
All right, thank you. All right, so this is where Ehtmigsurveydata is available on so this is our UKDS website. And so Ehtmigsurveydata, it provides all the information here about what it does, what it is, etc. And we created also quite a few documentation files to come with it, and that includes a guide on how to install it and how to run it. And this is very detailed. I already have it open here. So it provides information on where to download it from. This is both for Windows and for Mac. And so, of course, because we're time limited today, I've already done some of the downloading and the the programming, but as I said, this is very comprehensive. As you see, it's very, very long, and if you follow the steps, it should work fine. And if not, of course, you can always contact us if you run into any issues with it. Once you install it, it it will run. So if you have any questions when you install it, you can always contact us. Okay, so I will just go ahead now and so we will need the terminal. I'll open now. This is for Mac as well, so I'm using the Mac instructions. If you're using a sorry, if you're using a Windows computer, there's information there. So I'm just going to skip to where I was, to where I stopped the steps. So I've done all these steps, and now I'm just going to, and I've also, you know, I created a folder with the data that I'm going to use. And this is here, QAMD, so QAMD from QA My Data. And I have the data here in this folder, so I have it both in CSV and in Stata. Okay, so I have it prepared, and I will just run some commands in the terminal here. It's just a few, as I said. I already did most of the work to save time. But so I did all the installation, and now I'm just going to run, I'm going to ask QMyData to check a data set. Okay, so I will skip to the command. Okay, so I'm going to use this command here. I'm going to have to write it now. Here we need to change, so I will have to change this because my my folders are named differently. But this is also a good example if you're going to use this and download it on your computer. So I need to put the QAMD, so that's the name of my folder, and I have a folder called data. And then the name of my data set is teaching data .pta. I'll use the Stata version. Okay, so what I did now is I changed this standard command here to the name of my folder that I showed you earlier, where I have my data set. And now I'm just going to write the rest of the command. This is so that the output, we'll just call it results .html. Okay, just trying to have both windows. Okay, okay, and then I'm telling it to use a config file. This is the config file that you can customize depending on you know, the types of checks that you want QMyData to do. Okay, okay. And this file is also in the folder that you download when you download QMyData, and it is in my folder. Just quickly show you. Okay, so in my QMyData folder, we have the data folder, and this is the config file. Okay, and you can, this is the one that you can customize. Again, this, we don't have time for this, but there is information available in this document on how to do that and how to customize that. Okay, right, so I think I've written this correctly. Hopefully it will run, and yes, it does. Okay, so as you see, it's running the data set, and now hopefully when we go back to the folder, it produced the results HTML file. Okay, so this is the same file that I provided a screenshot in the presentation. So it's telling us the title of the data of the file, the case count. It gives us some information at the top here about the data file. And then we move into the checks that it did. Okay, so first it also checks the file name. When you archive your data, there is some file name. There are some file naming conventions as well, and one of them is that it shouldn't include, for example, this you know, percentage symbol. It shouldn't be there. It should be an underscore. So it will check for that. So it's telling us there's a bad file name. Metadata checks, so it's telling us the data file has missing variable labels, variable odd characters, the maximum length of the label has been exceeded, and the threshold there was 79. Okay, so in red we have the tests that have failed, and in green we have the tests that have passed. Okay, and then we have data integrity checks. So there are no duplicate values, but we do have a string value spell check that has failed, and a system missing over threshold, and we put the threshold at 25%. Okay, and then disclosure risk, we do have some variables with unique values, so we'll have to look at that, but this test is passed, so there's no string value stop words. Okay, so this is how the report would look like. And so this is very useful, you know, if we want to, and then, and if we click on one particular test on the red, it will also give us information about the variable name. Okay. For some reason, it doesn't give us the row number here. It should. I'm pretty sure that some of them would give the row number. Again, this would depend on the data set that you are using. But I'm not sure. Oh, there we go. So it's telling us the row number and the variable, so you know exactly where to go and fix it. I'm not sure why for some of the tests it didn't give me the row number. I'll need to look into that. But yeah, it's very useful. Once we have these tests, we can easily go and fix that, and provide very good quality data sets or publish very good quality data sets. Okay, so that was the demo. I will stop sharing my screen now, and I had the final how to prepare for sharing slide. So probably we don't have time to go over this. I'm just preparing for questions now, but so yeah, make sure that you prepare and provide archives with rich and valuable metadata and documentation, and that you prepare this throughout the data collection process, so you don't have to do all this work once you get to the archiving point. That you clean and you check the data that you're providing, and again, that you're organizing and naming, and so there are file naming conventions I mentioned earlier, and versioning data files meaningfully, and if data contain personal or confidential information, that you decide, well, of course you will have to, but that you think in advance of what legal gateway you're using, and if this is consent, it's important that you mention in that consent that you're planning on sharing that data. That's very important. We have seen examples where in research projects where the consent form was very, very comprehensive. It really ticked all the boxes, but it didn't inform participants that the data would be shared with third parties or would be available for future reuse. So that's very important that you also include that in there, in the consent form or information sheet. Okay, and in terms of where to publish data, I included here some examples. So regarding the question that someone submitted earlier about how to choose an archive, the core trust seal, it's a trustworthy, it's sort of the I don't know, the test that all archives need to pass if they want to be seen as trustworthy and accredited. So I would check their website, and they will point you to Core Trust Seal accredited archives and repositories for you to share your data. Again, I don't have time to provide more information on this now, but yeah, I'll let you look at that. And then, of course, you might prefer to publish with the journal that you're using, so as an access to a paper, or you can choose an institutional data repository. So as I mentioned, normally more and more universities now are developing their own, and then we have national repositories as well, such as NSD in Norway, DANS, Netherlands, GISIS in Germany, us in the UK, and then we have the general purpose repositories such as Dataverse, Zenodo, and the main specific. Okay, so we at UK Data Service, we focus on social science, but there are others as well that that focus on archaeology or other fields. Okay, and finally, I just wanted to include here a testimony from one of the participants that that was part of our seminar last year. So you know how important it is for them for the data to be available for future reuse. They really mentioned that they would want their contributions to have an effect, maybe not for themselves, but for migrants in general and for future generations and policy. So I think we can take it upon ourselves to at least try and do our best in terms of to ensuring that perhaps we're collecting very valuable data that will not be available, of course, in the future. So yeah, try to make your data as fair as possible. Okay. Right, and now I had a discussion exercise, but you know, just to talk in general about the FAIR requirements, and you know, based on your experience that you've had with publishing perhaps before, what are the challenges and opportunities that you see? And there's also a self-assessment tool here for FAIR data that I'll let you look at as well. I don't think we have time for this discussion now, but we'll just do questions, I guess, yeah, thank you very much. I hope this was useful in understanding the FAIR principles and how to go about publishing our data in a fair way. Okay, thank you. So I'll just wait for questions now.
There are several people writing. Yeah.
Sorry. The only question I can see is that whether we'll share the slides. Yes. Yeah. I know I have skipped over, you know, and I haven't opened slides and videos, but there's a lot of information in the slides that will be useful to look at. Yeah. Wow, we don't have any questions.
No, I think we don't. I guess.
Almost.
Yeah, I guess that we don't have any questions. Then we can finish the morning sessions here.
I just had one question.
Oh, okay.
I was wondering, because I was checking the core trust seal, and it is not a database itself, so just it redirects you to databases that are affiliated or something like that.
Yes, so it's not a data repository, it's not an archive. It's a international sort of standard of that would provide accreditation to archives and data repositories. So a data repository or an archive that would want to be core trust sealed accredited would have to satisfy certain conditions, and some of those conditions they're in line with the FAIR principles. So if you want to choose an archive or a repository that you know, that abides by the FAIR principles, a good place to look would be on the core trust seal you know, list of accredited archives and repositories. Yeah.